Welcome to another portrait painting video, except this time it's all acrylic. I started by painting the dress. Now for the dress, I didn't really want a realistic look. I wanted more of a flat graphic kind of style, which is sort of just a mishmash of my love for the style of comic books and animation. For the most part, I did solid shapes of color in varying shades of gray to indicate highlights and shadows. Overall, just keeping it relatively simple. I also did about 2 to 3 coats for each shade to really make sure I had a solid color at the end of it. Now in some areas, as you've seen, I did a little more blending, very small areas. Now I say blending very loosely because I wasn't so much blending colors together, rather adding a very small transition in certain spots. And I did those just by slightly watering down the previous dark shade of gray and essentially applying it like watercolor. And I continued this process for the rest of the dress, taking the previous color, adding a bit of white, and moving on to the next section. Also, because I was working with the same batch of paint from the very first day, rather than remixing an entirely new gray, I just made sure to keep my paint covered and wet. Keeping acrylic paint wet by just giving it a quick spray of water really does wonders. Using the same dark gray from the dress, I used it as a base for the metallic portion of the necklace around the little gems as well as the actual chain. Now, once I finished the dress, I was originally going to do the second dress, but because the second dress was going to be white and very light grays, I wanted to make sure I had the background done first to really make sure that my values were going to be accurate. Because I was planning on a pretty dark background, it can be kind of misleading because really it's very easy for any sort of light or medium gray to feel brighter against such a dark background. So basically, painting the background first kept me from going too light or too dark on the dress. In comparison to the first dress, I did do quite a bit more blending, and that was the choice I made to keep true to the actual dress in the photo reference. The dress had a lot of different fabrics like lace and tulle, and I realized if I stuck to the same defined sections of the other dress, it really wouldn't do it justice. When painting the second dress, I focused a lot on the mid-tones first, painting the lighter, sort of mid-tone grays, before going back on the second day and deepening some of those shadows because I wanted it to be very high contrast. Having those really dark shadows compared to the much lighter whites would create the effect that I was going for of a very sharp highlight. And using those same lighter grays, I used it to add little bits of detail onto the necklace. If you want to see how I painted the necklace, I did live stream the entire process. I unfortunately have to cut it out of this video for the sake of time, but I do have the entire live stream up for you guys. Once I had the dresses done, it was finally time for the faces. So I did end up painting a bit of the hair before the actual dress. And again, it was about color, because color is quite affected by the colors and values around it. For the hair, I really just focused on getting the darker areas done, especially around the hairline area, which I would later blend into the skin. Now, onto the main event, actually painting the faces. Now, there was a lot of mixing. I laid out a bit of red, yellow, white, and brown. Brown was really nice in this case because it gives me a very easy starting point that I can then adjust from. Also, I still had a bit of leftover gray from the dresses, and I added in very small bits of this gray to the paint that I was mixing for the skin. Now, whenever you incorporate bits of other colors you're using, it's a very easy way of unifying your colors, even if they are very different from one another. And I did this a couple of different times, using the same gray to make both of the dresses, using that same gray and adding it to the green background, and adding it to the hair and to the skin. So even though they are all very different colors and shades, they all still feel cohesive. Now, the key to creating a realistic portrait with acrylic, which notably is a bit more difficult to blend in comparison to oil paint, was layering. And I sort of did this in a watercolor approach. My first layer, as you can see, was watered down just to establish color and value. My second layer was quite thicker, and that was just a little bit more about coverage, making sure the white of the canvas really didn't peek through. And the layers that came afterwards were quite thin, really just focused on blending and creating those transition shades, deepening any shadows, or saturating any areas that felt a little bit too pale. And I did this in the same sort of way I did the first layer, just mixing my paint, watering it down, and blending. And it really does take a bit of patience, but it was very worth it. And again, you can see this process with the second face. I don't really worry about how accurate, or rather lifelike, the first layer is, because it's all really going to come through afterwards. The first layer is always about just setting down some color, setting down some value, sort of in the same way an underpainting functions. Now, besides this sort of watercolor approach to layering, I also do a lot of dry brushing, which you can see a little bit more with this second portrait. Dry brushing with acrylic is always just such a, I guess you could say, easy way of softening up any sort of transition shade, any sort of shadows and highlights. And I did this sort of how the name suggests, with a dry brush, just a little bit of paint, and really going in and working my way through it. And I applied the same method to the hands. So in between painting the faces, I also worked on the hands, just layering down some color and then continuing on to add a bit more detail. And you can really see the difference between these two clips on this slow approach to blending with acrylic and the difference that it makes. Now, by this point, the actual portraits were done and it was time to finish the background. So when I originally painted the background, as you've probably noted, the background was somewhat transparent. It wasn't a very solid color. It was just solid enough to give me a dark-ish background to help me establish the values on the dress. So at this point, I really took the time to clean up any edges that of the background that were smudged while I was blending the skin, as well as just making it a solid dark green color. And here we have the finished portrait. Here's the finished painting. I'm so in love with how it came out. It was many hours. I think it was definitely more than 24 hours. Need to check on the final count. I had so much fun with this and sort of combining my two favorite methods of painting, which is very much like this like sort of flat graphic style versus the actual like sort of realism that I've really enjoyed doing these past couple of years, and getting to combine both of those again in a painting has been really fun and unique in the sense because this is the first time that I've done it all in acrylic. Usually when I've combined those two elements, I've used oil to make the sort of realism that I've sort of been practicing and getting used to. But this time I went for full acrylic. If you've seen my older videos, you know that I've done like a sort of realism, sort of flat graphic with my rose painting. And I think that was really what drove me to want to create that realism with acrylic and sort of give that a try. It's been many years since I've done a portrait in acrylic, much more a realistic portrait. So this was definitely a fun challenge that I kind of want to try again and experiment with, because it was definitely a lot of fun, even if it was very long. But yeah, I love how this turned out and how it's so simple, but also everything that I love, which is like the high contrast between values, like straight up going from white to very dark, almost black. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you next week with a new one. Bye!